Welcome to the Zangabai newscast. It's June 16th, 2021, and I'm your host, Mike Gurecki, bringing you the news and inspiration from nature's front line. Today we're looking at the growing world of bioacoustic research and taking a listen to a number of recordings of wildlife, from lemurs and elephants to right whales and humpbacks. We have a couple new animal calls to play today, spotted owls in California and bearded seals in the Arctic. All of the other wildlife sounds we'll hear were featured on previous episodes of the Zangabai newscast. Many of the scientists using bioacoustics in their research who have appeared on this podcast in the past were supported by the Cornell Lab of Ornithology's Center for Conservation Bioacoustics at Cornell University in upstate New York. So our guest today is Laurel Symes, Assistant Director of the Center for Conservation Bioacoustics, but actually make that the K. Lisa Yang Center for Conservation Bioacoustics. Thanks to a $24 million endowment gifted to the center by K. Lisa Yang, a philanthropist and member of the Lab of Ornithology's advisory board, the Center for Conservation Bioacoustics is getting a new name and will be able to expand its support for conservation bioacoustic research and technology around the world. Laurel Symes tells us about the impact this new $24 million gift will have on the center's work and discusses a couple recent examples of how bioacoustics are informing scientific research and conservation strategies.
This is an incredibly exciting time to be part of the field of bioacoustics. The earliest sound recordings were being made in 1929, and these were short recordings that took a vehicle full of equipment and several people to be able to make a recording. And so here we are in 2021, not even 100 years later, and instead of making one short recording with a day's effort and thousands of dollars of equipment, we can capture thousands of hours from many places on Earth and begin to imagine using sound not just as a way of understanding what was in an environment, but understanding what's there at the time. There's a lot of different ways that this can touch our lives, but it's been a field that's constantly been challenged by finding the next small grant and having one or two specialized, dedicated people working on a particular project without the sort of continuity and scope and just scale to make these approaches applicable in a way that really impacts conservation. And so that's one of the incredibly exciting things. Right now, it's a huge privilege and challenge and just an exciting time to be in this place, in this field, as we begin to think about, what can we actually do over the next 15 to 30 to 50 years? That's a time scale that we've seldom had the luxury of thinking at before, but it's a sort of time scale that's really going to be key to making technology and approaches that people can use in conservation in a meaningful way to have an impact.
After our conversation with Laurel Symes, we'll take a tour through some of the best examples of bioacoustics that we've featured on this program, many of which, as I said before, were supported in some way by the Center for Conservation Bioacoustics. But first, here's Symes to give us a bit of background on the center for those who aren't familiar.
Our center is about 40 people, and we're part of the Lab of Ornithology, and we're a group that specializes specifically in bioacoustics and bioacoustics for conservation. So in that group, there's a bunch of scientists and also engineers and software developers. And so it's people who build equipment, people who build software, people who do research in the field, and people who teach others how to do these things. And so that group is really focused around creating equipment that can capture long recordings from natural environments and find the sounds of specific animals and other sound sources in those recordings. And then we're interested in being able to use those recordings for research and also teach other people how to do this sort of work. And so right now, we've been stretched really thin, actually. Most of the things that we do, there's one or two people that are capable of doing it. So for example, we build the terrestrial Swift recorder, and right now that's a one-person team. Even though there's thousands of units in circulation, there's really one person that develops that hardware and builds that unit. And so one of the things that we've struggled with is just not having much depth. If somebody's out for a little while, or there's just a big order that comes in, or anything happens, there's really just not a lot of give in the system to be able to keep doing what we do.
Well, presumably the $24 million grant the center just received from its new namesake, K. Lisa Yang, will help with that, yeah?
Yeah, so we are so incredibly excited and grateful about this gift. It will name the center the K. Lisa Yang Center for Conservation Bioacoustics with a $24 million endowment. And what this endowment will enable us to do is to provide stable funding for some of the positions that are so central and core to what we do, and to expand the teams a little bit. So rather than having one or two people building the Raven software.
The Raven software is a sound analysis tool built by the center.
We actually have a team of maybe 3 or 4 people, so that there are people who are building new features and also people who are able to keep up with changes in operating systems and licensing and new updates, and just build a little bit more robustness into the things that we do. It will also enable us to really make long-term commitments to partners on the ground. So we do work, especially in the tropical regions of Central Africa and Southeast Asia and Latin America. And one of the things that's been so hard about being grant funded is most grants have a 1 to 5 year duration. And so you get money to go in and you do a project, and you meet people, you work with people, you collaborate, you do something together, and then the money is over and you either leave or you have to find other funding and other ways to be able to keep working. And so it's been really hard to lay out a 5, 10, 15-year plan of what's really needed, both in tools development and in collaborations around conservation. And so the really spectacular thing about this gift is that it allows us to separate a bit from the need to fit what we do into the little compartments of grant funding, and instead be able to make a plan that's really around what's going to be most effective for conservation bioacoustics over a long time span.
Tell us a little more about what it means for the center to be able to make longer-term commitments to projects on the ground.
Yeah, so one of the things that we're really invested in doing is being able to work with people who are experts in a particular region. I'm not an expert in the birds of Latin America or the mammals of India or the primates of Southeast Asia. What we are experts in is how to build this equipment and apply this technology. And so one of the things that we're looking to be able to do is to actually work with people over a long enough period of time that there's the chance to really understand what's needed in particular sites, and to build equipment and technology and approaches around that. And then to be able to go back years later and continue to work with partners in an area and, for example, test out statistical methods in Latin America that could be applied in Central Africa and Southeast Asia, and be in these projects long enough to not only just start an idea and begin to do the work, but actually to see it through to conservation application.
So you've mentioned the Swift recording devices the center makes, thousands of which are probably deployed in the field right now. And you mentioned the Raven software, which is used to analyze the data collected by those recording devices. Can you just maybe take a minute to explain to us how these pieces fit into what you might call the bioacoustic research workflow? Or so in other words, just tell us a bit about how bioacoustic research actually happens. How does it work?
Yeah, so historically, people have used animal sound for a long time to understand animal populations. Even probably our early ancestors were accustomed to listening to animal sounds. But early ornithologists, early biologists were going out with a notebook at 5 or 6 o'clock in the morning during the dawn course and doing something called a point count, where you stand in one place, usually for 10 minutes, and count how many different species of birds and sometimes individual birds you hear during that time. And so it gives you a way of monitoring and comparing sites. And so this is an amazing approach. You get lots of information, and there are places like Hubbard Brook Forest in New England where you have a record that dates back 50 years of humans going to these spots every year and taking these records. But when you think about just the manpower that's involved in doing that at dozens of locations, hundreds of locations, there's only a certain number of places that you can visit, because in a particular morning, I can only get to 2 or 3 places at dawn course. And so the amazing thing about using bioacoustic recorders is it can amplify that effort. I can spend all day putting out 40 recorders, and at dawn tomorrow, they all turn on for the same 10 minutes and capture that 10 minutes of sound at all the different sites. So you have a really comparable record. And I'm only a mediocre birder. If I'm out doing a point count you're going to have what I think I hear and everything that I could identify. But maybe there's something that I heard and it was really hard for me to identify, or I misidentified it. That sound is gone forever when you have humans doing point counts. But when you have recorders out, you can bring that 10 minutes of sound back, and other people can listen to it and can provide feedback and input, and you can use it for training. And it's not biased by the fact that I'm not very good at identifying a particular species, or maybe my hearing isn't very good anymore at the high frequencies. And so they're really stable, repeatable records. And so just in the recording itself, it's been a huge transition of being able to capture these sounds that are a record in perpetuity, in the same way that other scientists have captured water samples or soil samples. Now we can capture sound samples and hold those so that researchers in the future can look back at what we were hearing now. But one of the things about recording with this equipment is that you generate just enormous quantities of data. So let's say I just used 40 recorders and recorded for 10 minutes each. That's already 400 minutes of sound just from one day. And if you have even more recorders and you're recording every day or for longer periods of time, very soon you can capture more sound than any human could ever listen to in a lifetime. And so very quickly after we solved the recording challenge, we created an analysis challenge where there's just stacks and stacks and stacks of data that we somehow have to interpret and make meaning of. And so some of the early transitions there were the ability to turn sound into an image. And so you could make a printed image of the sound that was on the recording. And then we developed computer software that could show that image. And now we're working on computer software that can actually make sense of that image. And so machine learning has been a game changer for us, where instead of individual humans going through or maybe developing a computer algorithm for one particular type of sound produced by one particular species, now we can begin to process sound for lots of different species and go through a sound file. And essentially what you get is a timestamp and a species identification. And these are far from perfect, especially if it's a noisy dawn course and there's lots of overlap between different species and there's background noise. We're not at a point where the computer algorithms can do a point count as well as a person can, but we're getting closer fast. And so this can really change the way that we capture data from natural environments and the way that we make sense of lots of long recordings. And so you can get out lists of what species are present in a particular type of forest, or what species are present year after year after year after year as that forest gets older, or nearby areas are developed for housing or for roadways, to begin to understand what species are using what types of habitat. So for example, you can ask whether there are more species of cavity nesting birds in places where dead trees have been left standing, and get answers to these types of questions over a very large spatial scale and over extended periods of time.
Just to further illustrate how conservation bioacoustics work, let's talk about a couple of recent examples of bioacoustic research and how they're helping inform conservation approaches. For instance, a study came out earlier this year that was led by researchers at the K. Lisa Yang Center for Conservation Bioacoustics, and it looked at whether or not bearded seal mating calls can compete with the increasing amount of industrial noise in the Arctic.
One of the challenges for us as bioacousticians is going from monitoring to conservation application. We're starting to get good at saying what species are there, but going that next step to apply it to decision-making about natural environments is one of the frontiers for what we do and what we need to be doing. So the bearded seals are an awesome example of this. This is a habitat that's really hard for humans to monitor. It's under the ice. We're not going to be able to stick our head down there and get a good sense of how many seals there are and what they're doing, but you can drop a specially made piece of equipment into the water and capture these sounds. And what these researchers did was to begin to understand how loud these seals could get, because the environment under ice is naturally loud and getting louder with commercial shipping and cruise ships and various sources of sound. And so what they wanted to know was, are the seals capable of keeping up as the environment gets louder? Are the seals able to call louder and louder so that they can still use their sound to attract mates and to tell each other where their territories are at. And so they found that the seals actually are capable of getting louder, but there's a limit to that. They can't just keep going and going and going as the environment gets louder. And so that begins to give us a sense of how much ability they have to respond to human noise, and at what point they're just going to be so swamped that they can't continue to engage in the behaviors that are essential for mating, for reproduction, for existing under the ice.
We actually have a recording of a bearded seal that was made as part of this study to listen to right now. And to all the listeners out there, if you've never heard a bearded seal call before, you're in for a treat. It sounds like sound effects from a sci-fi movie or something, but I assure you, this is the call of a bearded seal recorded in the Arctic by Center for Conservation Bioacoustics postdoctoral researcher Michelle Fournette, who led the study. Okay, we've also got a recording of a male spotted owl to listen to. This comes from a study led by Connor Wood at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, who used 200 of the center's Swift recording units to study the impacts of invasive barred owls on native spotted owls in California's Sierra Nevada mountain range.
The barred owls are also, it's a very different type of project. But one of the spectacular things about the barred and spotted owl project is just the scale at which this happens. Because these are recorders that are all over the Sierra Nevada. The scale at which this happens is like 2,300 square miles of forest. And so within this forest, the researchers want to know how prevalent are barred owls. So barred owls compete with spotted owls for habitat. And so as there are more and more barred owls, it makes it harder for the spotted owls to occupy an area. And sometimes there's hybridization between the two species. So the presence of barred owls is a real threat to the persistence of the spotted owl population. And so these researchers were able to put out recorders and begin to get a sense of how many barred owls are in the area, or at least how prevalent they are. Are they everywhere? Are they only in particular areas? And they found that there weren't that many barred owls out there, but the population was going up fast. So just from one year to another, they went from like 8% of the sites to 16% of the sites they were detecting barred owls. And so this gives them a sense of what areas have barred owls in them, where the spotted owl is going to be most threatened. And it also gives them a way of tracking any interventions that they might try. So if they go in and attempt to remove barred owls or to modify the habitat in ways that will favor the spotted owl, one of the things that's challenging in conservation is assessing what you've done. It's easy to sit and think of all the things that you could do that might help a natural environment, but getting that information on how your management action has impacted the outcome in the environment is really important. And so in this case, Bioacoustics gives a good tool not just for understanding where barred owls are occurring, but also how management actions are changing or not changing the number of barred owls that are in the range of spotted owls.
All right, let's give a listen to the spotted owl. And it's a pretty quick one, so let's listen to it one more time. So, Laurel, I read that there were 200 of the Swift recorders used in this study, and they covered 2,300 square miles with those 200 recorders?
Yeah, so when this project started, it was part of the PhD of one researcher named Connor Wood, and he had about 200 recorders that they rotated across the landscape. And so they would go out for a little bit, maybe about a week, and then they would go pick them up and move them to another site. And so by using a few units and a lot of manpower, they were able to cover a lot of space. But you can think about just how quickly that manpower adds up. Often it's more efficient to actually get more recording devices. And so now there's about 2,000 Swift recorders, I believe, in the Sierra Nevada. And one of the beautiful things about acoustic recording is that it captures all sorts of things. So once you've gone to the work of putting the recorder there, you maybe were recording at times when owls were present, but you can have that same unit turn on in time to capture the dawn chorus. And so now, in addition to having 2,000 sites where you have owl presence, you also have the sound of dawn chorus from 2,000 sites, and we can use some of these machine learning type approaches to begin to extract information about the other species of birds that occur in these same locations that have already been mapped for things like forest type and forest density connectivity. And so by layering on additional research questions from these same recorders and recording units, you can get a lot of information for the work that you've already done.
So they used the Swift recording units and they collected about 200,000 hours of audio. And then they used the Raven software to identify barred owl hoots captured in those recordings. Is that where the machine learning comes in, to be able to identify a particular species within those hundreds of thousands of hours of recordings?
There's a couple different approaches going on here. So the OWL project has used Raven and something called a detector in Raven. So it's looking for a particular sound of a particular species. And that was effective for owls because owls call often at night when there are relatively few other sounds. They're pretty distinctive sounds. They're repeated. They're pretty consistent when they're produced. And so that was something that worked well with a detector for a single species. One of the things that we have to jump to go to a world where we can analyze lots of species is dealing with the complications of, for example, songbirds that are learning multiple songs, and individuals are experimenting and creating new sounds that are still identifiable as that species, but they're not this precise template that's produced again and again. And so this is where machine learning becomes really useful because it uses some of the same technologies that we use when we're transcribing speech. So for example, if you're speaking to your cell phone and it's transcribing what you're saying into a text message, it can apply some of those same technologies to capture the variation between individuals and yet still distill it down to that core species identity. And so that's something that's part of BirdNet, which is another software that comes out of our center, but it's a machine learning approach to identifying birdsong. And so in this case, we're actually not yet running the machine learning algorithms in Raven, but that's one of the things that being able to hire a couple more people and having a little bit more financial support will enable us to do, is actually to take that classic Raven software that people have been using for years and years and years to process and identify sound, and take these new machine learning approaches and integrate it right into that software so that you don't have to have a PhD in computer science to use these approaches. All you have to do is download these pre-trained models from the internet. So you could download birdsong identification or a primate model or an insect model like we've been building for katydids in Panama. You can take these trained models and essentially import it into the Raven sound analysis software and then apply it to the sound files that you've been recording.
Well, that sounds really cool.
I'm personally really excited about that.
This is probably a good time to mention that in addition to being assistant director of the K. Lisa Yang Center for Conservation Bioacoustics at Cornell University, Laurel Symes is also a biologist and practicing bioacoustic researcher. She's using bioacoustics to study tropical katydids, a grasshopper-like insect in Central America. You can hear her talk all about that research on a January 2020 episode of the Zangabai newscast, which we'll link to in the show notes if you're interested. So, Laurel, can you tell us about, are there any barriers or limitations to the expansion of bioacoustic research in places where it would be useful around the world?
There's lots of different types of challenges that need to be solved to really take this to scale. So first, there's technical hardware challenges. Right now, we're running off of 3 D-cell batteries in the Swift recorder, and we just released the Swift 1, which is a new version of the Swift recorder, and it has much better battery life. And already that changes a lot of things about how often you have to go to sites, what sort of recording schedules you can use. And so, sort of the beginning challenge is just getting the hardware to the point where you can make these really long recordings with minimal service, with really high reliability, in places where you get good sun access, building in solar options or big batteries. So there's hardware level challenges, but there's also software challenges and just usability challenges. So on the software side, things like dealing with these really noisy environments. So we can now with BirdNet, if you download the phone app, you can record the sound of a bird singing outside, and the app is more than 80% accurate at identifying it for thousands and thousands of species. It's amazing. 3 years ago, this hardly existed, and now, you can download it off the internet and use it in most places in the world. So the software is jumping forward, but there's still quite a few circumstances that are hard because that is a really nice focal recording of a species you're interested in. But now imagine that you're out in the forest and there's 3 different species calling at the same time, and there's a thunderstorm rolling in and it's getting windy. That's a much more challenging environment. And so that's one of the places that we're still pushing on, both with the software for processing sounds, but maybe also with the hardware for being able to use multiple microphones and begin to separate out the source of those different sounds so that it's more like the problem of identifying a single, clean focal recording on your phone. So there's software challenges in just being able to process really long sound files effectively. But then maybe the most important challenge is the usability challenge. We can build hardware and software all day long, but if it doesn't serve the needs of the researchers and the conservationists who are applying it, it's not going to get used and it's not going to get applied to conservation challenges. And so as we build all this equipment and develop recording approaches, one of the things that we keep emphasizing is how do we make this accessible to people? And that's not just researchers in big, well-funded labs in the US, but people who are working in Latin America, people who are working in Central Africa. How do we get equipment? How do we get training to the people who are living in these incredibly biodiverse regions and making management decisions about often huge areas of forest with lots of amazing biodiversity, but also incredible human needs for wood, for fiber, for food? What are the ways that we can support those management decisions that are often made at community levels, but providing ways of getting good data about environments for making those decisions and then assessing the outcomes of them?
So, as you know, Zangabai founder and CEO Rhett Butler co-authored an opinion piece published in Science back in 2019 that called for greater collection of soundscape baselines and the creation of a global organization to host that kind of acoustic data and make it available to scientists all over the world. What do you think of that proposal? Would an organization like that, a central repository of bioacoustic data, be helpful?
The soundscapes that we're collecting now are some of the most valuable soundscapes that we'll ever collect because as bioacoustics becomes more and more prevalent, there will be lots more sound coming in, but we can't go back and recreate the sounds that we're capturing now. And so these are some of our baseline recordings. And so finding ways of really curating these well and making them secure and publicly accessible will do a huge amount for the community. But it's quite technically challenging. Even within our center, we're sitting on about 2 petabytes of data. And much of that we're very happy to share with the world, but it's not as easy as just, go onto this website and download our archive. You'd be there for years and years trying to get that much data to download. So in the era of easy internet access, it's tempting to imagine that anything can just be passed quickly over the internet, but we're still talking about quantities of data that can be debilitating over most internet connections. And so philosophically, it would be wonderful to have just one big central library where everything resides and you go and you pull what you need. But the reality of implementing that is challenging, which isn't to say that it's a challenge that we shouldn't tackle, but it will have to be done thoughtfully. So one approach might be having multiple institutions that hold pieces of that collection with a central repository that says these are the things that exist and how they were recorded and where they're held. And And then researchers would go to those different institutions to access those recordings. The amount of recording that's available now is trivial compared to what is poised to come in, because a lot of those early recordings were made at low sampling rates and for short segments of the day. And now if you imagine, just the Sierra Nevada project, there's 2,000 recorders recording maybe 6 or 7 hours a day, all summer long, every day. And so if you think about what that means in terms of data file size, not only is the current library huge, the future library is almost unimaginably huge of what could be collected and could exist. So finding good ways to store and interact with those data sets will be key to being able to use them in ways that are meaningful for conservation. But COVID has really underscored just how valuable that could be, because lots of researchers just watch their field plans go down in flames. You can't go to Panama, you can't go to the Central African Republic. All of a sudden, especially graduate students who are just beginning their career, they're a year or two into their graduate program and they've never had the chance to collect data in the field. But especially for people who do bioacoustics, what that has meant is often that we open that archive and suddenly even recordings that were made for different species than the ones that they're interested in have the species that they care about. And they're able to go through and study bird populations and study insect population dynamics from these recordings, even at times when it's not possible to go and visit the field. And so the fact that I might be recording for insects doesn't mean that my recordings are unvaluable for somebody who studies frogs or somebody who studies birds. In fact, when you've done the physical work of collecting these recordings from the field, there are actually lots and lots of things in there that are valuable to different researchers and different research questions. So, for example, if we'd had recordings from Central and South America 50 years ago, we would have a much better idea what the amphibian populations were like before the most extreme challenges from chytrid fungus.
The global outbreak of the chytrid fungus is believed to have already driven as many as 200 species of frogs to extinction. We spoke about chytrid with biologist Jonathan Colby on an October 2018 episode of the podcast, and we're actually going to hear some recordings of frogs he made as part of his research in just a bit, so stay tuned for that.
But because there isn't that sort of baseline data, it makes it really hard to know how some of those populations have changed. But if I'd been out there recording for insects and there were just happened to be frogs on those recordings, then suddenly you have that frozen time point in history that you could go back to for insects or for frogs or for anything else that was making sound in those nighttime recordings.
Well, it's obvious that there will be a lot more crucial conservation bioacoustic research for us to feature here on the Zangabai Newscast in the coming years. But just to wrap up for now, Laurel, could you maybe say something, leave us with a few words on the importance of bioacoustics?
This is an incredibly exciting time to be part of the field of bioacoustics. The earliest sound recordings were being made in 1929, and these were short recordings that took a vehicle full of equipment and several people to be able to make a recording. And so here we are in 2021, not even 100 years later, and instead of making one short recording with a day's effort and thousands of dollars of equipment, we can capture thousands of hours from many places on Earth and begin to imagine using sound not just as a way of understanding what was in an environment, but understanding what's there at the time. So, for example, things like real-time detection, where you have a network of recording units and they're listening all the time and processing using these machine learning algorithms for particular sounds. And so if you hear, for example, the sound of chainsaws in a protected area, being able to send a text message to the park manager saying, chainsaws detected at approximately these GPS coordinates, and being able to intervene very quickly in things like illegal logging. Or if you have an endangered bird species, having this network of recorders, again, that are listening for the presence of nesting pairs and being able to go in and strategically close small areas of the park where there's nesting taking place so that it's not disturbed by the public. Or being able to put recorders on the top of tall buildings and listen for the flight sounds of migratory birds and turn off the lights in those buildings so that they don't interfere with migration pathways. There's a huge number of potential applications for acoustics at the landscape scale, and even acoustics engaging with the public. So for example, if you're out listening using one of these phone apps, it can tell you that you're hearing a bird that you've never heard before and give you some information about what bird that is so that you have a chance to try to see it and just notice where you are and where and when you're hearing this bird for the first time. And so there's a lot of different ways that this can touch our lives, but it's been a field that's constantly been challenged by finding the next small grant and having one or two specialized, dedicated people working on a particular project without the sort of continuity and scope and just scale to make these approaches applicable in a way that really impacts conservation. And so that's one of the incredibly exciting things right now. It's a huge privilege and challenge and just an exciting time to be in this place, in this field, as we begin to think about, what can we actually do over the next 15 to 30 to 50 years? That's a time scale that we've seldom had the luxury of thinking at before, but it's a sort of time scale that's really going to be key to making technology and approaches that people can use in conservation in a meaningful way to have an impact.
Because we're such big fans of bioacoustics here at the Zangabai Newscast, and as a way of even further illustrating the breadth of bioacoustic research, we thought it would be fun to spend the rest of this episode looking back at some of the more interesting animal sounds we've featured. First up, we're going to hear some recordings made by the Elephant Listening Project, which is actually based out of the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, though its field work is conducted in the Central African Republic and the Republic of Congo. Anna Verarami, a research analyst with the project, joined us to play some forest elephant recordings and explained how learning about the elephant's communication can help to improve protections for the species. The Elephant Listening Project has acoustic recording devices deployed in clearings known as bais, as well as in the forest. Verarami was kind enough to supply us with some examples of the recordings informing the project's research.
Here we're going to take a listen to what the forest actually sounds like. So not just an elephant-centric location, but what all the biodiversity in basically the Congo Basin, what that sounds like at once. So this is a daytime clip. It's a really, really cool thing to listen to.
The next sound clip is from Zangabai in the Central African Republic. Zangabai is one of the forest clearings that ELPS researchers are working at.
This was taken during the day, and it's really cool actually because at night it sounds really, really different just based on other species that are out communicating versus not in the day. But here you'll hear a bunch of elephants basically talking to each other, negotiating over the mineral pits that they're there to drink from, and it sounds kind of like Jurassic Park. It's really cool.
Let's listen to an example of elephant communication at Zangabai. It features a greeting ceremony between two elephants who have been named Kate and Tess.
Very similar to humans, where if you've, probably what I'll do after this pandemic is over, I'm going to go see my friends and, I'm going to yell and be super excited and, hi, how are you? How's it going? I haven't seen you in so long. And similarly, we think that's what elephants are doing. And so while they're in the forest, it's just a mom and her offspring, which is usually one or two, based on the age of how old they are. But they're coming to this clearing and they're seeing family members. We actually have data showing that a mom will come and her daughter, who's also has her own family at that point, will come to the bai on the same day. So it's really interesting. We don't know what's driving it. We wish we knew. Hopefully one day we will. But similarly, friends will also do the same thing. So here we're going to listen to something called a greeting ceremony between two elephant associates or friends named Kate and Tess. And so this happens, I think, right in front of the platform, our observation platform. So it's kind of loud. But basically, the interpretation of it is that it's two friends meeting up after a long time, super excited, asking each other how they've been and just yelling about it. So
Last November, I spoke with Valeria Torti, a research technician at Italy's University of Turin, whose work is focused on critically endangered Indri lemurs in Madagascar. Torti shared a number of recordings of their calls with us and told us about the population and demographic information scientists can glean from these audio recordings.
So the first clip we are listening is part of a duet emitted by the reproductive pair of a family group of Indris in the Marumisa forest in eastern Madagascar. This clip make us hear the overall song structure that is, as I told you before, is made by a brief introductory series of roars followed by long notes that are particularly emitted by males. And then we successively can hear the proper song, that is a succession of notes in which every note has a frequency that is lower than that of the previous unit. This is a duet, so we have an adult male and an adult female singing.
Let's give it a listen.
From our studies, we found that songs have a consistent sex group and individual-specific features that could help us to infer about the groups and population composition. And we also found that there is a significant correlation between genetic distance between individuals and between members of each family group, and the acoustic similarities of their notes. And this is especially true for the notes composing the descending phrases. These notes inform about genetic relatedness that is especially true for males. Male vocal signatures have been indicated as an important mechanism for inbreeding avoidance, and what we think is that the fact that male songs convey generic information may help females in avoiding mating with related males. And this is, in fact, functional in a species that form long-term bonds like the Indris, and in a species in which extra-pair copulation may occur, as we have observed, for example, in Marumisa, and those providing the females with the potential to discriminate with related males could be very interesting for increasing level of genetic diversity in the population.
Okay, so tell us about the second clip we're going to hear.
The second clip is what we call a chorus. That is a song in which more than two individuals participate. In this clip, we are listening to a part of a song emitted by the reproductive pair and their young daughter. The structure of the song is always the same, and but we have one more individual of the same sex, in this case a female, that is singing with the mother. And during choruses, when two Indris of the same sex sing, they could both sing together or alternate their contribution during the song. So in this case, we have a daughter that is 1 year old, so she is singing by partially overlapping the mother. And we think that this could also help the youngster individual to start to sing in a proper way this kind of different and difficult, very complex signal.
All right, we'll give it a listen. Back in November of 2019, we welcomed Dina Klink to the program. Klink is a primatologist and postdoctoral fellow at the K. Lisa Yang Center for Conservation Bioacoustics, who studies individuality and variation within Bornean gibbon calls. Most of the bioacoustics we've featured on this podcast are used to study wildlife at the population level, or even to study whole ecosystems. But Klink told us that studying how calls vary from gibbon to gibbon can not only help us learn about their behaviors, but also to better protect them in the wild. We'll listen to the solo call from Maliau Basin first, so tell us what we should be listening for. What are we going to hear?
Something that I always find pretty entertaining is when I'm out doing my research at these field centers. We do get tourists quite often, and if they see me there with a microphone or recording, they'll be like, oh, what kind of bird is that? So they do sound, it sounds quite bird-like. And the male solos, I find them really fun. Like they're kind of like, in a way, to me, it sounds like almost haunting in a way. And because they always do it just by themselves, I always kind of think of them as being a little bit lonely and like kind of like, oh, you know, I wish somebody would come and like, you know, hang out with me, or I wish I could find a girlfriend. So it sounds, I don't know, a little bit melancholy maybe. But it also could be that they always do it before sunrise, so it's out. You're up very early while you're listening normally.
Okay, here's the male solo call from Maliau Basin. And next we'll listen to the duet call from Maliau. Tell us about this one.
The duets, they start out generally with the males and females kind of alternating back and forth with these short notes like doop, doop, whoop, whoop, whoop. And then the female will go into this longer part where the notes are kind of drawn out. So it'll be like woo, woo, woo. And then I cannot replicate the second part of it. It goes into a trill, which is just a fast, the notes are repeated rapidly and very fast. And so that's something I will not try to emulate for you guys. But so the female part is really, of the duet, is kind of the most distinct. And then the males stop singing completely. They'll just be silent. So it's quite easy for us to pick them out. And also from an analysis point of view, there isn't much going on where the male's singing over the female.
All right, here's the duet call from Maliau Basin. And now we've got the solo and duet calls from Danum Valley, and we'll find out in a minute, of course, but are these calls going to be similar to the ones we just heard? Do Bornean gibbons essentially all do the same calls, or are they each coming up with their own songs?
Well, that's a really great question, and that's something that I have been really interested in throughout the course of my dissertation, is trying to understand if there is variation among or between individuals. So if I go and record this male soloing in Maliau, does he sound different than the male soloing in Danum? Which that's actually an area of active research for me, so I can't tell you that yet. But for the duets, I've focused a lot on that, and the fact that there are differences between individual females and their duet contributions, and there also are some slight level differences in terms of how fast they're repeating the end part, the part with the trill. And then if you go to southwest Borneo, there's another species of gibbon, the white-bearded gibbon, and they do not trill at all. So they sound completely different than the species that we're going to be listening to here.
Okay, so what do we need to know about this solo call from Danum Valley?
So the reason mostly that I wanted to include the ones from the different sites is that the males do sound different. They're a little bit shifted in frequency, but then also to listen to kind of the background noise or the ambient noise of the two sites, and to just see kind of what's going on in terms of the differences of not just the gibbons, but everything else around them too.
So here's the Danum solo. Anything special we need to know before we hear the Danum duet?
There are differences in terms of kind of just how they sound, and in terms of quantifying those, I haven't really done that yet. So it's just kind of, I think, fun to listen and to know that they're from different places, and to see if you can pick up on those differences too, which of course I listen to these so much that I'm like, of course they sound so different.
Here's the Danum duet. In September of 2019, we spoke with Jim Darling, a marine biologist with the Whale Trust Maui, an NGO in Hawaii, who played for us some recordings of remarkably similar humpback whale songs from around the world. Darling was part of a team of researchers who recorded humpback whale songs over the course of 3 breeding seasons at sites across the Pacific, in the Philippines, Japan, Hawaii, and Mexico. They found that the songs were so similar to each other as to be nearly identical. Darling said that means our view of the whales as living in distinct groups might very well be wrong, and that view dictates a lot of the conservation measures we've designed to protect humpback populations. We've got 4 recordings to listen to for comparison, one from each of the 4 main subpopulations of North Pacific humpback whale. But we've also got another recording to listen to first that is an example of a theme change in a humpback song. Tell us what we're going to hear.
We sort of have to just get back to the basics of song a little bit. And, humpback whale males produce this 10 to 20 minute long sequence of sounds, very loud sounds, mostly during the winter half of the year. And when they get to the end of this sequence of sounds, which, an average song might be 12 or 15 minutes long, then they start again at the beginning, and then they keep repeating this sequence. The sequence, though, is not simple. It consists of patterns of sounds which are repeated, and we call these patterns phrases. So a whale will repeat a certain phrase some number of times, maybe over several minutes, and then we'll just stop and change to a new phrase, which it will repeat a bunch of times. A few more minutes down the line, we'll change again to another phrase. And this repetition of a single phrase is called a theme. It varies a little bit, but often, the whales in the North Pacific at least have 4, 5, 6 themes in their song at any one time. So, it just, if you think of, letters of the alphabet as different sounds, a typical song would start with a phrase which might be A, B, B, and the whale will repeat the A, B, B, A, B, B, A, B, B for a few minutes. And that would be theme 1. And then it would shift to different sounds, a different phrase, which might be CD, 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 CD. After a few minutes, it will shift to yet another phrase, which might be E, F, 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 E, F, 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 and it will repeat that until it gets to the end of its sort of current repertoire of sounds. Then it starts at the beginning again. So that's the general composition of the song. But where it gets interesting, or more interesting, is that these songs change, or this composition of song changes gradually over time.
Okay, so here's an example of a theme change in a humpback whale song. We've got recordings from 2012 to 2013 made in Hawaii, Japan, Mexico, and the Philippines to listen to. As you were saying, these songs change over time.
And in fact, the pace of change varies, and we're not quite sure what triggers faster change or slower change. And even in some parts of the world, as it happened in the North Pacific, there can be very abrupt changes where the whales change their entire song fairly quickly. But the most common situation, certainly in the North Pacific, is the songs gradually change over, periods of weeks or months, where you start to see little differences, from weeks or months earlier. The thing here is, though, that all the singers in a population change their song together. In other words, at any one time, if you go out and make a recording of a singer, you get a certain song. And if you go, 3 or 4 kilometers away and make a recording of another singer, they'll both be singing the same version of this song. And the same will be true with all of the singers in a certain population, say in Hawaii. So the way we're using that is we're saying, okay, if the whales, the only way that one can explain this is the whales sort of had to listen to each other and somehow meld songs or incorporate the changes of their neighbors. We're not quite sure how this works, but it apparently does. So if we make recordings of singers in different locations in the North Pacific and they're singing the same version of this ever-changing song, then we say, okay, they had to mix somewhere along the line. And that's pretty much, what we're doing to define these populations by their song.
Okay, so the first recording we'll listen to is from Hawaii and was made in 2012. You and the Whale Trust made this recording, right?
Yes. Our study in Hawaii has been going on for a long time, decades, I guess. And yes, we record each season off of Maui. It's just a very good place to study whales. What you're going to listen to here is the same phrase, which, is recorded in all of these four locations across the North Pacific. I think the phrase is, I think it'll be very easy to see that it's the same phrase spanning the ocean. There is a little bit of difference in the sound, which is because the ocean conditions are different in each of the locations, and the distance from the singer is probably a little bit different, and the hydrophones are probably slightly different. But it's the composition of the phrase that we're interested in, and that's identical. I mean, it will not be hard to make the match.
And these are all from 2012 to 2013?
Yeah, the study spanned the years 2011, 2012, 2013. The song changes gradually enough that the same phrases are found in each of those years.
Okay, here's the recording from Hawaii, 2012. Now here's a recording from Japan made in 2013. This recording is from Mexico, made in 2012. And finally, here's a recording from the Philippines, also from 2012. Humpbacks might be known for their songs, but none of the 3 species of right whale had ever been known to sing until research biologist Jessica Krantz documented right whales singing for the first time ever with her team at the U.S. National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, also known as NOAA. All the way back in July of 2019, Krantz came on the Mongabay newscast and played for us recordings of critically endangered North Pacific right whales breaking into song in the Bering Sea, though these songs aren't quite as melodious as the humpback songs we just heard, composed as they are of so-called gunshot calls. After analyzing 17 years' worth of data from autonomous recorders they deployed in the Bering Sea, Krantz and team documented 4 distinct song types at 5 different locations. We're going to play a couple of them now. When you hear the word song, you might be thinking about melody, harmony, and rhythm, but that's not what you should be listening for here, as Krantz explains.
It is difficult to listen to them and think, oh yeah, that's a song, because they sound very, very different from what people expect to hear. So, when you're listening to this, you want to listen for the very regular timing in between them. It's a very consistent spacing or consistent duration between the gunshots. And with this clip also, you can hear there's almost a progression where at the end of the clip, the gunshots sound very different from they do at the beginning. And we think this is something that the whale is doing as opposed to just an artifact of propagation, because it is like that in every iteration, in every song that they sing, that there is that progression of gunshots, which is really interesting to hear.
Okay, let's take a listen. The other eastern North Pacific right whale song type we're going to hear today is also composed entirely in gunshots, but the timing is substantially different.
So you'll hear kind of 3 gunshots in the beginning, and then there's a short, about 2-second duration of silence, and then they start up with gunshots that have a kind of an alternating amplitude. So it goes from loud to quiet and loud to quiet. But then it slowly, throughout the song pattern, the amplitude then becomes consistent throughout. So instead of it being loud, quiet at the beginning, at the end of the pattern, they're the same volume, basically.
Here's that song. I mentioned earlier that we'd be listening to some frogs, and that will be our last bioacoustic recording of the program. Biologist Jonathan Colby founded the Honduras Amphibian Rescue and Conservation Center to study and rescue frogs affected by the chytrid fungus. Tree frogs in Honduras' Cusuco National Park, some of which are species found nowhere else on Earth, were being decimated by the aquatic fungal pathogen when Colby appeared on this podcast in October of 2018. He played for us some recordings of the frog species he's working to save from the deadly fungal infection.
2 of the audio clips are from Cusuco National Park. Those two are one of the Casuco spike-thumb frog, Plectrohyla dasypus, and the other one is the mossy red-eyed frog, Monohydralia cerealia. And the other recording is of a chorus of frogs right outside the frog rescue facility at Lancetilla Botanical Gardens in Tela, Honduras.
First up, we'll listen to the call of Monohydralia cerealia.
So what we hear here is an individual of the mossy red-eyed frog, Monohydralia cerealia, which is a gorgeous little frog, about 2 inches across. It's mottled with kind of green and maroon with bright red eyes and a yellow belly. And it's an endangered species found only between the border of Honduras and Guatemala. And it has a really unique, fun call. It almost sounds like a dog squeaky toy in my mind. It's like a double-pitched, like, it's actually a point of interest for my rescue team because frog calls are really diagnostic per species. And this particular call that we've been studying is a little bit different than what we've seen published in the literature. So that's a point of research for us right now is actually to better understand the language of some of these endangered frogs that we're working with.
Okay, here's that call.
So there's 3 species that the Honduras Amphibian Rescue and Conservation Center has targeted for conservation. And that's the mossy red-eyed frog, the Casuco spike-thumb frog, and the exquisite spike-thumb frog. All 3 of these species are either endangered or critically endangered on the IUCN Red List, and also extremely limited in distribution. So the mossy red-eyed frog is found in about 4 or 5 very small fragmented populations, the largest of which we believe is located in Casuco National Park. So the animals that we're working with are very, very significant for the survival of this species. And the other 2 species that we focus on, the Casuco spike-thumb frog and the exquisite spike-thumb frog, are only found in Casuco National Park. So they're extremely vulnerable to any outside threats, especially disease, because there's no other population. This is it.
So tell us a little bit about the recording of Plectrohyla dasypus that we're going to listen to.
So Plectrohyla dasypus, the Casuco spike-thumb frog, has a really unique call that almost sounds like a duck quacking, often 3 times in a row and then pausing and resting in between. It's interesting because we often try to locate the frog making a certain call so that we can visually confirm, what it is that we're hearing. And this species in particular, we hear this quacking call, usually at night, which is when these frogs are active. But sometimes we've started hearing this call in the middle of the afternoon, right when it gets cloudy, around like 1 or 2 p.m. And we have never, except on one occasion, been able to find a frog making this type of call during daylight hours. So some of us believe that there actually might even be a second species of frog at this site that we haven't described yet, which behaves a bit differently. But it's actually something that we're studying right now, is what are the calls of some of these frogs that we've never been able to confirm.
Okay, here's the call of Plectrohyla dasypus. Our third and final recording is a chorus of frogs, as you mentioned. Any particular species we should be listening for?
So this chorus, I believe, is a bunch of chattering frogs at night outside the Honduras Amphibian Rescue and Conservation Center. There's a little lily pad garden, and every night these frogs just come out en masse. I believe it's some Lithobates frogs and some Dendrosophis frogs, and they're just extremely vocal and charismatic and splashing around in the water, also with some cane toads. And they're more generalist species that you find lower down in Honduras. High up where we work in Casuco National Park, it's up in the mountains. So we have a lower diversity of species, but the species are more isolated and localized. But once you come down to the lowlands in Tela, you have a much higher abundance of individual frogs, but they're more generalist species, and that's some of the ones that you hear here.
All right, that's all we've got for Bioacoustics today. Hope you enjoyed listening as much as we did reporting on all these stories. If you do enjoy the Mongabay newscast, we ask that you please help spread the word by telling a friend. That's the best way to help expand our reach and keep the show growing. Another way to help is by becoming a monthly sponsor via our Patreon page at patreon.com/mongabay. We are a nonprofit news outlet, so just $1 or more per month would really help us with offsetting production costs and hosting fees. So if you're a fan of our audio reports from Nature's Frontline, please head to patreon.com/mongabay to learn more and support the Mongabay newscast. That's patreon.com/mongabay. And you and your friend can join the listeners who've downloaded the Mongabay newscast more than 250,000 times by subscribing to the Mongabay newscast wherever you get your podcasts from. Or you can download our app for Apple and Android devices. Just search either app store for the Mongabay newscast app to gain fingertip access to new shows and all of our previous episodes. And of course, you can read all of our news and inspiration from Nature's Frontline at mongabay.com. Or if you prefer to keep up with us on social media, follow us at facebook.com/mongabay or on Twitter and Instagram. Our handle is @mongabay on both those platforms. Thanks as always for listening to the Mongabay newscast. I'm your host, Mike Gurecki, signing off. Talk to you again in 2 weeks.